Well, as folks probably know, over the weekend we've had a dramatic shift in activity at KīlaueaVolcano. The summit, which had been subsiding in these periodic collapse events, as we were calling them, had its last such event on Thursday last week about noon. After that, we returned to an increasing number of earthquakes, as has been the long pattern now since late May. And then over the weekend, instead of proceeding to another collapse event, the level of earthquake activity died way down to extremely low levels. At the same time, the deformation of the summit, the ongoing deflation that we've been measuring steadily now for some months, flattened out. So this was a significant perturbation in the pattern. Coincident with that, we also had a dramatic slowdown in effusion, or lava output, in the lower East Rift Zone at the Fissure 8 vent. We, on overflights over the weekend, saw that the amount of lava entering the channel was greatly reduced, and in fact this morning even there was some bubbling and churning of lava within the vent, but lava was not actively being added to the channel. And folks may remember that as little as early last week, this wide river of lava had been fed from Fissure 8 heading all the way to the ocean. There's still some active lava at the surface as the lava flow continues to drain and ooze here and there, but overall the eruption rate has drastically reduced. With that, the amount of sulfur dioxide coming out at Fissure 8 has drastically reduced. Basically, the system appears to have almost shut down completely over the course of a couple of days. Now, we did see some hints that this might be coming. As we look more carefully at the data from early to mid-July, we were beginning to see some changes in various parameters that now, in retrospect, were early signs of the system going through a change. Of course, the big question is this mean the eruption and collapse activity is over? And the answer is we can't be sure. Clearly, we're in a pause or a lull, and we just have to wait and watch in the coming days and weeks ahead to see how the system evolves, whether it continues to slow down and truly stop, or there does remain the possibility that activity could resume both at the summit and in the lower East Rift Zone. As a reminder, in 1955, there was an eruption that went on for 88 days, and it did include 2 shutdowns of 5 and, I think, 16 days. And so that's a model for what might be happening. Similarly, there's no reason to believe that it can't start up collapsing again at the summit. Longer term, if activity changes permanently in this direction, we have to then think about what other hazards might be out there. As the summit has changed so dramatically over these months, we now have a very deep crater. We have a significantly drained summit magma reservoir, and we're trying to think about the possibilities of what that might entail for ongoing hazards in the summit. I think one thing people are going to ask is why has this happened? What does it mean? And the several hypotheses that exist. One are that we've had basically a slowdown in supply to the summit magma reservoir, which has basically brought the whole system to a halt. We don't have evidence for or against that, and we're looking at ways to test that hypothesis. The other possibility is that there's been a blockage in the system somewhere that basically prevents further draining of the summit and further outflow in the lower East Rift Zone. But again, we have no evidence for that, really. So we're continuing to search for explanations for what's going on, because that should help us determine what will happen. I'll stop there.
Our first question comes from Alima Loomis with EOS. Your line is open.
Hi, thank you. You mentioned that in early July you saw some early signs that the eruption might be slowing down, or in retrospect you realized you were seeing those signs. Can you explain further what those signs may have been?
Sure. Well, probably the most dramatic one to see in a graph is looking at the duration of the repose intervals between the collapse events at the summit. We began a pretty steady increase in that repose interval. So between these step-down collapses, more time was passing, which seemed to correspond with a slowing down of the collapse process itself. Interestingly, our geologists who spent the daylight hours up at the summit watching activity noted that in that same time period, the duration and character of rockfall activity from the western part of the caldera wall seem to change and diminish as if potentially the magnitude of seismic shaking on that side of the caldera was diminishing or at least changing. So that was another one. Down in the lower East Rift Zone, we saw periods of what were lower effusion or suggestions of lower effusion. The channel level would drop well below the levee rims at times, and the lava fountain heights within Fissure 8 were beginning to decrease. So those were some of the characteristics. There were probably others, but those are what come to mind right now.
Thank you. And when did you see these changes start?
Roughly the middle of July, early middle of July. Mm-hmm.
Our next question comes from Damian Tucker with Big Island Now. Sir, your line is open.
Yes, are you guys expecting the lava to rise back up inside the crater?
At the Kilauea summit?
Correct.
Well, I guess that's one possible outcome. I wouldn't say we're expecting it, but it could happen. And if we see the summit magma reservoir begin to refill and the summit will begin to inflate, it is possible that magma column could rise back up to the surface. That has happened historically prior to other summit collapse events. But at this time, we have a very open pipe going down the rift zone, and so it may be that magma is diverted in that direction rather than coming up into the summit caldera. But we can't completely discount it.
Our next question comes from Nina Wu with Honolulu Star Advertiser. Your line is open.
Hi there. Good afternoon. You mentioned that it isn't uncommon for the eruptions to it's common for eruptions to wax and wane and sometimes pause. So historically, what is the longest pause that we've ever had? Did you say 16 days in 1955?
16 days characterized the longest pause in that eruption, yes.
Have we had any longer than that ever, or?
Let's see. Nothing is leaping to mind. One of the problems, of course, is a little bit semantic. If you have a pause of longer than a few months, we tend to call them new eruptions. So I think the main thing, though, is that volcanoes worldwide can go through pauses or lulls and certainly periods of diminished activity within the course of a single eruption.
Okay, so
a pause of days to a couple of weeks is not completely out of the question.
Our next question comes from Michael Phillips with Weather Boy Weather. Your line is open.
Hi, my question is for Tina. With the hurricane expected to pass south of the island, I was wondering if USGS is doing anything differently with the observations in the fields. Are any scientists being pulled in until the storm passes? Any equipment being hunkered down? Anything changing because of the tropical storm watch that's up for the island?
Yeah, thanks for that question. We have had some internal discussion and analysis of whether we need to do anything differently, and at this time I'm not aware that we're going to be doing anything different with field equipment. Everything that goes out, we try to harden it for all conditions, including tropical storms being here in Hawaii. I understand that the Civil Defense here in Hawaii is closing down the Lower East Rift Zone eruption site during Wednesday, which is when the full brunt of the storm is expected to hit the island. So we will not be sending field crews there, but we'll have people on standby should there be some kind of emergency. But of course, our foremost concern is our own personnel safety, so we won't be going out into horrific conditions. We're of course encouraging our staff to take care of themselves and their families and prepare for the storm. So no, we're really not doing anything differently other than thinking about contingencies for if we lose access or if some of our equipment goes down, how we're going to get it back up quickly.
You said Civil Defense is closing part of the area. What part is that?
It's the Lower East Rift Zone, so it's where Fissure 8 has been erupting. We have been sending field crews there 24/7 now for several months, and so their plan, as I understand it right now, is to cease operations. In other words, they're not going to let folks go in unless it's an absolute emergency. So we'll honor that and not go in. And coincidentally, the activity has greatly reduced. So we're actually, if you take the hurricane out of the equation, we are similarly going through a bit of a mental exercise now about how do we want to change or should we change our ongoing operation given the reduction in activity. I want to emphasize that because this could just be a pause, we need to stay very vigilant, and HVO staff are continuing to look at the data all the time, and we're going to keep up our close monitoring. But it may change character in some ways now that there's not lava pouring into a river. We may look at some different ways of doing things. And last night, for instance, the drone team was out there overnight, and the report was silent, silent, and dark, dark. So we don't need to be flying drones to verify that. There are probably some other ways we can do that.
Thank you.
Our next question comes from Austin Westfall with Hawaii News Now. Your line is open.
Hi. On Friday, gas measurements of the Pu'uo'o vent, they said there was plumes and there were emission rates of over 1,000 tons of SO2. I'm wondering what this could be an indication of.
Yeah, thank you for asking that. That was another, in retrospect, another potential hint that the system was changing, because it's been a couple of weeks ago that we began to receive reports of a white plume coming out of Pu'uo'o. And as you'll recall, when it collapsed on April 30th, it really went quiet, and we saw nothing and no activity and no plume there once the rockfall dust from that collapse settled. And you're correct. On Friday, our gas team measured an order of magnitude increase in the SO2 output from 100 or 150 tons a day up to over 1,000, which is the highest SO2 output from Pu'uo'o in more than, I think they said, 10 years. So that's very interesting. We do not fully understand what that means, but at the very first order, we can say it does mean that there's magma at a fairly shallow level below Pu'uo'o that's degassing. Whether that means that system is moving towards lava reemerging within Pu'uo'o or not, we really can't say. That will be a surprise to us if that happens. But at the first order, there's magma degassing below Pu'uo'o, and it's shallowed to give us that increase in number. But we did do a flyover this morning, and our geologists looked down with eyeballs and FLIR camera and did not see any sign of lava or excessive high temperatures. There was, however, a continuing plume of gas and water vapor coming out, obscuring somewhat the inside of the crater. So we'll be keeping an eye on that. But thankfully, that is in a remote part of Hawaii Volcanoes National Park, and so even if lava were to resume coming out at the surface there, which I still think is a long shot, it would not immediately endanger anyone.
Our next question comes from Jennifer Kelleher with Associated Press. Your line is open.
Hi, what impact could the approaching storm have on the volcano, if any?
We do not anticipate any process response from the volcano. Heavy rain will create likely white-out conditions over the still warm lava flows or still hot lava flows. I should say that even as of this morning, there are parts of the lava flow that are still moving, still incandescent, at very high temperature, and there still is active lava in fissurate. And interaction of heavy rainfall with those hot surfaces and material will create steamy whiteout conditions that are hazardous right in that vicinity. But we don't expect it the storm to actually do anything to the volcano other than slightly change the hazards at the surface.
You said whiteout conditions?
Yes, this has been noticed in the past during Pu'uo'o lava flows that go to the coast on the coastal plain area. The interaction of water with this hot lava or warm surfaces can create, basically it's like being in a spa, and so it's very dense clouds of steam that can have a little bit of sulfur dioxide in them. And the main danger, though, is if you're ever caught in one of these things, is that you can't see where you're going. So it's another reason I'm sure the Hawaii County Civil Defense folks will continue to remind people that the new lava flows are in a closed area.
Okay, thanks.
Our next question comes from John Burnett with Hawaii Tribune Herald. Your line is open.
Hello, Tina. How are you doing? My question about Pu'uo'o was basically answered, I got one more. The flow front at the ocean front, has it gotten any closer in the past day or so to the Pohaliki boat ramp?
I'm looking at my update from today, and the answer is active lava is close to the boat ramp but has not advanced significantly. I'm sorry, I can't give you any numbers, but that's what we said today in our update.
Yeah, I read that. Thank you.
Our next question comes from Steve Gorman with Reuters News. Your line is open.
Hi, thanks very much. Can you describe in a little bit more detail, how what exactly is happening at Fissure 8 in terms of lava either bubbling out or just kind of oozing out as opposed to fountaining out before, or maybe it has stopped more or less altogether, or it's intermittent, or can you just maybe describe, what you would see if you were there?
Sure. We have a couple of pictures on our homepage, our website, with photos that will show it to you better than I can describe it in words. But basically, the Fissure 8 vent has created this cone that's got a crater inside of it. And what was happening until this weekend is that lava was sort of welling up inside this crater, and there were fountains bursting through the pond that existed in the crater, and the lava was spilling out and filling the channel and feeding the flow to the ocean. This morning, to me, that what looked like is that inside that crater there still was a little pond of lava. There were, if you will, little bubblers kind of coming through the lava, not fountains blasting tens of feet into the sky. It was a very subdued sort of bubbling, not so much fountaining, and no lava was making it up and out of the crater. In addition, the surface of the lava pond was more crusted over and dark and black than it typically was as late as last week. So overall, just a reduction in vigor, a reduction in certainly output, and a reduction in gas output, all consistent with basically something turning off the spigot to the surface.
Thank you very much.
Our next question comes from Jennifer Kelleher with Associated Press. Your line is open.
Hi, sorry, I missed the very beginning of the call, so apologies if this was already addressed. But is there any indication that this pause could be followed by a larger explosive event and subsequent surge? And if so, does the more solidified lava channel mean that lava flows could spread into new areas?
Let me answer your question in reverse. Should lava resume at Fissure 8 and come out with vigor again, it will likely at first reoccupy the existing channel, we would expect, but you're right, it could spill in different directions depending on the geometry at the time. One thing that could happen in the coming days to weeks is that the cone might start to fall apart a little bit, so there might be new pathways for the lava to move. And in fact, in the report that was published just a couple of weeks ago by USGS about ongoing hazards from Fissure 8, we described some of the different paths that lava could take should it start to occupy different trajectories than the current channel. So that is a possibility if a vigorous eruption resumes. The other possibility that still exists is that lava could break out from a different location. In other words, remember the 24 fissures that characterized the early part of this eruption. While we will be surprised if some of those other fissures reactivate, that is still a possibility. So that's one reason we have to be vigilant and watch the entire zone. Another possibility is that if the eruption continues but at a much lower rate, in other words, we don't get this river of lava pouring out of Fissure 8, but a smaller, for lack of a better word, dribble, we might have a new vent structure form, more of a shield-like structure, and in those cases, lava can eventually go in lots of different directions. So all of that is to say we really need to see how the eruption evolves to understand which areas will continue to be downflow from and at risk of lava inundation. The other part of your question about risk of a larger explosive eruption, currently we see no evidence that is something we're concerned about in the near term. There's no seismicity, there's no deformation, there's no clear evidence that we're getting a surge of magma back into the summit system. So right now things look pretty stable and safe. But with that said, we can't rule out the possibility that will change, that it will move into additional collapse events, and even with the possibility of explosions and larger explosions than we've seen to date. Again, a report that was published about a month ago talked about the various scenarios for what's happening at the summit. And at the time, we said that the most likely scenario for the next couple of months was continued collapse events, and that did persist and come to pass in the following month. But we always acknowledge the possibility that the events could migrate in a direction that was more explosive and more dangerous. we say that when we still stand by that being a very unlikely possibility, but we can't take it off the table completely.
Okay, sorry, when you said creating new pathways for lava to move and you were talking about the cone, you said that if the cone falls apart or it could fall apart.
Yes. Right now it seems to be a pretty stable feature, but we did see in our overflight today evidence that the interior walls have been slumping downward through time. These things are made of spatter and tephra, and they're not inherently not stable, and we could see some collapses through time in the coming days.
Okay, thank you.